Hello, how are you doing? I hope you had a good reading month in April. It's a nice day out, so I thought I'd film out here in my garden studio. And every time I film out here, I become aware that I haven't changed the batteries in this clock. And I know some people have pointed this out before, and I really need to do that because, it's just static and not moving. Although it weirdly, it finished just before 12. That's when time stopped. So I feel like Cinderella sort of suspended in this at the ball, like not having to go home in my pumpkin. But and I feel like this reading month has been really charmed and wonderful because at the very end of March, I'd finished writing the manuscripts for the books that I'd been commissioned to write. And so I suddenly had all of this free reading time again. So I've just been reading, and it's been so wonderful. I just feel like I've been able to indulge in books in a way that I haven't for the past few months. And so I've read quite a lot. I've read 12 and a bit books. Quite a lot. And in that bit of a book, I read 300 pages of the book. So it's not like I didn't read any of it, but it's actually one that I gave up on and decided to abandon. So I think I might talk about that first. And a lot of these are books that were longlisted for the Women's Prize for fiction. So I have already talked about a number of these books with Anna in a video I did about her, but I think there's a lot more to say about them. And so I'll give a bit more commentary about them when discussing all of them. And the first one I'm going to talk about is Remote Sympathy by Catherine Chidgey, which I was still reading this week, and I decided a couple of days ago to actually give up on finishing it, and not because it wasn't shortlisted, but because I had some issues with the structure and frame of the narrative, which I couldn't get past, even though I did feel really interested in the story and admired how she was doing it. But just how it was framed didn't work for me. So this is set during and after World War II, and in a community that's close to a concentration work camp, and involves an officer and his wife and a doctor that was imprisoned at this camp, who comes up with this experimental method for treating cancer. And so it revolves between their points of view, as well as some very short sections giving the points of view of the community. And how she framed it is through the SS officer, giving testimony many years later, his wife creating this fictional diary of their time there, and also of the doctor, the prisoner, writing a letter to his daughter. And I don't understand. I guess if I got to the end of the book, I would understand why she framed it this way, but it feels like so many of the sections were written almost as a conventional narrative, and it revolves between their perspectives, so you get their different points of view, but quite a lot of those sections are made up of what could be just a normal third person narrative, because there's a lot of dialogue and discussions between the characters, which, if this really was a testimony or a letter or or even though the diary is said to be imagined, that raises even more questions, because if you're imagining this diary, would you really create all this dialogue between the characters without sort of admitting that well, I'm just making all of this up? And I just that whole frame felt really troublesome to me, and I wish I understand she was trying to give the different points of view, and you do get little snippets of the characters in their first person narratives, almost giving more away than they realize, but not enough to actually, I think, make it work. And of course this is a work of fiction, so it's all made up by the author. I understand that, but there's a sort of conceit between the reader and the author that you have to believe in the structure that was made for the story, and I just couldn't believe in that and get into that, no matter how interesting I thought the story was, and I thought it was being handled quite well, although I could really see, how she was setting up this story and how the different characters' lives were going to intersect and come together, and the conflicts they were going to have. There's a little bit of a section when the wife is wanting to have more children, and but then starts to get sick, and it's almost like in that film, The End of the Affair, based off from the Graham Greene book, when Julianne Moore is the actress in that, and she says to her husband at one point, "Oh, how many children shall we have?" And you're like, "Oh, okay, so she's going to be sick," and yeah, that's going to be the big issue of it. And so yeah, that did feel like it was a bit too obvious. So yeah, I'll be interested to go and read more reviews of this and see what other people think, because I know a lot of people responded really positively to this book, but yeah, I just decided there wasn't enough for me to want to continue on with it, and so I may go back to it at some point, but just I was getting quite frustrated, and even though I'd read 300 pages of it, I was like, well, why should I continue with this? Why don't I go on to read something I'm really, really keen to read? And so I did that, which is Young Mungo by Douglas Stuart. So I've been so excited to get to this, and disappointed I hadn't read it yet, even though it's only just been published. But I was sent an advance copy like at the end of last year, but still hadn't got to it, and because I loved Chidgey Bain so much. And yeah, this is it's a similar story in some ways, but also goes much deeper and darker into the lives of these characters, of these Scottish characters living in a particular time and place. And Mungo is a Protestant, but he meets a Catholic teenage boy named James, and they form a connection, a friendship with each other, and it's following their stories. But so how this is structured is that the frame around it is that Mungo has been sent on a fishing trip with a couple of older men that he's only just met, that his mother is sort of sent him, arranged for this trip, this kind of fishing trip, to kind of make him into a man. And you see scenes from this trip throughout the novel, while it also, then the scenes in between go backwards in time to show what led up to this and how Mungo got involved in the sectarian conflict, but also got in trouble because of the relationship he formed with James and how that had been discovered. And so yeah, how this is built up I thought was so clever and suspenseful. There's lots of really surprising twists which come along the way, and some very shocking moments and some really disturbingly violent scenes, but which are all quite justified in showing the hatred simmering beneath the surface of this community, between different religions, between men that don't conform with a certain image of masculinity and don't conform to the predominant heterosexuality of the community. And so yeah, it's so striking and moving how he depicts that, and the wonderful like intimacy between Mungo and James in the formation of their connection to each other, and how they open up emotionally to each other, and sort of how that is built up, and how he describes that in their physicality, I think is so well done. The way that Douglas Stuart writes about the physical bodies of his characters and how they inhabit them, and the awkwardness that they feel at times, I think is so relatable and moving, and yeah, but also how he builds up the relationship between this family with Mungo and his sister, who is quite like intelligent and free-spirited and strong and quite mouthy, which gets her into trouble as well, but also his mother, who suffers from alcohol addiction and is also frequently absent. She'll just like leave her children behind while going off and doing her own thing. And then his older brother, who gets really, who's kind of left to support the family. So I think he's somewhat sympathetic in that way, but he does that through dealing drugs. But he also gets so wrapped up in the religious conflict and in these sort of battles, street battles with Catholics, which are some of those scenes that are portrayed. The like explosive violence of that is really shocking, but. So overall, I just think this novel is so striking and wonderful and moving, and I'm so glad that Douglas Stuart was able to follow up his debut novel with another like very strong book that makes such a big statement about so many things, and which continues on from themes of his first book, but also builds upon them and shows a different perspective and a different point of view in a very specific situation, and yeah, it's just so well done. The Bread the Devil Knead by Lisa Allen-Agostini, and this follows the story of a woman named Alethea that's just turning 40, and she's a manager of a clothing shop in Port of Spain, and also involved in an abusive relationship, and has been for quite a while, and she's quite a self-contained individual. She doesn't have too many friends, and she's kind of estranged from her family. She's such a sympathetic character in that way. I mean, she's also a big reader. She loves reading, and so obviously any character like that I'll instantly connect to. But also how she's learned through her difficult circumstances that she has to fend for herself, and the way the author portrays that and builds that I think is so moving and powerful. And so I got completely drawn into this novel and her conflict about what to do about this abusive relationship, and feeling like, well, it's really nobody's business, and if I want to stay with him, then that's my own business, and how she portrays that in the conflict of that, and how the events play out. I think the more time has gone on, the more I've been thinking about it, and because I was slightly bothered too. There's like a couple of coincidences at the beginning of the novel where she meets some people, a friend of hers and a kind of half-brother of hers at the beginning of the novel. She meets up with them after having not seen them for a long period of time, but then suddenly bumps into them again, and the kind of coincidence of that, but then also the coincidence of how some of the events play out in the novel. I kind of wonder if maybe that's a bit too contrived in order to bring the plot together, but even if it was, I don't really mind, because I think the emotional resonance of this story is so powerful, and it's really an inspiring, wonderful story to know that it's on the Women's Prize for Fiction shortlist when the author had a lot of trouble getting this novel published, and so I've been learning about that since then, and so yeah, I think it's so wonderful that she's being recognized in this way. Build Your House Around My Body by Violet Kupersmith, and yeah, the darkness and weirdness of this novel I got completely sucked into, and I thought it was so compelling, especially because it is built like this puzzle where there are two young women in two different time periods that have gone missing, and it sort of builds each chapter from the point where one of the women went missing, and plots out the time period like 9 months before she went missing, or like 3 months after she went missing, and so building all around this incident. And so you're wondering about what is the mystery of how she disappeared and why she disappeared, and how she draws you into that story of this young woman who's American born with Vietnamese heritage and is traveled to Saigon to live there and teach, and so how she draws you into that story, and then the deep history and weird mythology of this landscape that she enters into, and how that's a reflection on her own conflict about who she is and where she fits in. Is she Vietnamese? Is she American? And that all of those issues I think is so well done, and but also about other people that have come to Vietnam, like French that have come to Vietnam and are children that are, you know, half French and half Vietnamese, and whatever community that they're in don't feel like they wholly belong there. That is so movingly portrayed around this very fantastical and wild story, and filled with so much intrigue. is just so well done. But also the humor of how Winnie, the American, how disinterested she is in her teaching job, is and how disinterested the students are in learning. So it's this kind of like mutual thing between them, and so yeah, she's a really horrible teacher, but just like how far she goes in that, I just think there's a really great humor to that, but also in other scenes of that, there are scenes where I generally felt a bit like freaked out by how the wildness of what was going on, but also it kind of savors the darkness and creepiness of all of that in a way which is so delicious and wonderful. And so I just found this completely compelling. Salt Lick by Lulu, Allison, and just looking at the cover, I'm like reminded of the sweetness of this boy's relationship he forms with a puppy, this boy from the country, and he takes on this puppy and raises it as his own dog, even though he's discouraged from doing so by his family in the community because they have dwindling resources, since this takes place in a future set kind of dystopian type landscape where the countryside in England is deteriorating and everyone is moving to the city. And so this boy is from a village in the country, and which has been literally dying out, and how she shows his story early on, I think is so moving. And then moving on to a young woman from the city who gets involved in a conflict that's much bigger than she realized what it was. Her mother died in a terrorist incident, and she goes to a prison to confront the man that she thinks killed her mother, who she thinks was responsible for this terrorist incident. And how that story plays out, I think is very intriguing and involving, and how that intersects with the boy's story eventually is really surprising. And so it was a wonderful revelation. And so I think plot-wise, this is plotted out really well, but at the same time I wish she had built in a bit more of both of their stories. I mean, I guess because of the way she had plotted it out, that's why we get more of the boy's story early on and then more of the young woman's story later on. But yeah, at the same time, I wish I'd seen like a bit more of their lives, both of their lives in the city, when the boy eventually moves to the city, and then when the young woman who was raised there and has lived there her whole life. Yeah, I just wish I'd had a bit better sense of the city and how that functioned with this overburdened population in this novel. But there's so many beautiful descriptions of nature and the countryside and the conflicts that people are facing, and also this Greek chorus of cows that are commenting upon the action, which I think does work quite well in the narrative, that they are like a Greek chorus that are just sort of there in the background, that are deeply attentive to all of the action which is happening and commenting on it, but are slightly removed from it, and so give this slightly different perspective on events and a kind of commentary on them, and sometimes insights into what actually happens in the story, because there's a boy from a kind of tribal community that are quite racist and homophobic, and this is a boy who's gay, who's realized he has to leave this community because of the threat of towards his identity, and there's another gay man from the community that sort of disappeared, and none of the people in this knew what happened to them, but the Greek chorus of cows knew his fate and describe it in their narration. And so I think, yeah, that's an interesting different perspective on events. And I'll talk a bit more about Greek choruses in a moment, because I read another book that also involves that. Now, The Exhibitionist by Charlotte Mendelson just did not get along with this at all. The story of a domineering patriarch who was an artist that became famous at one point, and he's been kind of living off from that fame ever since, and how his wife is also an artist that he's been kind of suppressing her career, or not encouraging her career because he's so centered on his own and their children. And the stages before he mounts this big exhibition, which is supposed to be his great comeback, and following the events around that, revolving between the different characters. And I understood what Anna was saying in the video we made together discussing this, and how she felt more sympathetic with the wife, and I do feel sympathetic with the wife and all of the characters that live under this domineering patriarch, because there are horrible people like this that are completely egotistical and totally focused on their own point of view. But yeah, I just felt I didn't understand there wasn't really any development to the characters, and I just found that so frustrating and intrusive, and so yeah, there wasn't enough of progression in this novel to, I think, make me feel really involved in the story. That the characters were, I felt like, I could almost write what was going to happen and what they were going to say after a certain point, or how they were going to respond to each other. And so, which is something that I think, like, Dickens kind of does, but is also one of Dickens' biggest faults in his novels, in that because there can be a pleasure in that, and feeling like the characters so well that you as the reader could almost narrate what is they're going to say and do next. But at the same time, yeah, that's just so frustrating, and there's like a warmth and humor to Dickens' characters, which I think is just lacking here. And there were some sections where I almost felt like I could read, like, oh, she's writing a joke here, she's trying to make a funny observation, but it didn't come across as funny or clever to me. I just felt so annoyed by this story, and just couldn't. I probably should have DNF'd it like around halfway through, but thought, oh, maybe if I persist to the end, it'll come together. But no, it didn't. It really didn't for me, and I didn't think it was worth it. And I know there should be like a certain satisfaction. I mean, this is a bit of a plot spoiler, but his exhibition is a complete failure, and the art he produces is so underwhelming. And as that was slightly satisfying in a way as a reader, to see him fail in that way, because he is such a monster and such a horrible person. But then at the same time, I felt like it almost would have been more interesting if he turned out to be actually a really great artist and had produced these great masterworks. And then where are you? And because I could almost see then why some of people close to him would make these compromises and say, like, oh, well, he's an incredibly difficult person, but he's a genius, and so maybe he's worth staying with. But no, he's not. And so then the question to me, I think, is totally clear. Like, he's not worth staying with. You should just leave him. And so yeah, I got so frustrated by this, and yeah, didn't enjoy it at all. Creatures of Passage by Morowa Yejide, which I'm so glad this was listed for the Women's Prize for Fiction, because I don't think I would have come across it otherwise. And the deep melancholy and reflectiveness of the characters in this, living in this disenfranchised community of Washington, D.C., and a woman that ferries around people in her taxi, which possesses almost a like supernatural ability that she can sense people that are in distress and need to be transported somewhere, and how she goes to pick them up, and so you see a number of journeys and people she transports in this, but all of these characters are involved in this larger plot to do with her great nephew and the boy's mother, and how the boy witnessed something at his school which he shouldn't have witnessed, and how that story plays out, but with all of these wild things going on in the background. And I think it's so powerful how you can feel the weight of history upon these characters, and the trauma that they're carrying with them in their bodies, and how she portrays that, I think is so powerful and so well done. In retrospect, I do have some slight issues with this novel in how the story plays out. I mean, it's basically the larger plot of the story is a story of vigilante justice being carried out against a man in the community who's a pedophile that's been preying upon children in the community, and so it does go into his perspective at one point, and I know Anna had some really big issues with that, because she hated being in his point of view, and I hated being in his point of view. It's so horrible seeing how the bad logic he was following to carry out these, and the actual way he went about carrying out these instances of abuse is so terrible. But then I realized that I think she showed that in a way to show, like, incontrovertibly, that he's absolutely guilty and that he did these horrible things. And so at the end, when he gets his justice, you almost feel like, well, that is justice being served in a way that couldn't be served, in a way through the law. And I am always somewhat suspicious about stories about vigilante justice in that way, because this is being carried out outside of the law, that it's not like he was subject to a trial, and you can see in the story, because it does go into his point of view, that he's absolutely guilty. So I almost feel like that's a way of like excusing that these sorts of acts should be carried out, and so yeah, I just feel slightly like wary of that in storytelling in fiction, like whether it's movies or novels, when that sort of thing happens, even though I realize it's an imperfect society. Justice definitely isn't always carried out by the law, because it just can't be. There's not any, I don't think, like system of government that can really carry out justice in the way that it ought to be, even though I hated this character and wanted to see him get his comeuppance. Yeah, I just had slight issue with that. But that's just some thoughts I've been having in retrospect, thinking about it even more, because the actual experience of reading this book, I mean, it's so good. The language is so powerful and beautiful, and how it's constructed and laden with all of this meaning. There are some absolutely stunning scenes, especially concerning her deceased brother in his passage in the afterlife, and how he's carrying out his own sense of revenge about the wrongs that were enacted upon him, is so moving. And yeah, those scenes I think have an incredible power too. And yeah, it's something I need to think more about. Sorrow and Bliss by Meg Mason, and this novel I know has been so beloved by many people, though it not by everyone. It has been a divisive book. I've heard a lot of people who had issues with it as well. So yeah, I thoroughly fell into it and really enjoyed and appreciated this point of view of a woman who is struggling with mental health issues and with her marriage, and the way she portrays that, and makes her so relatable in some ways, but then you gradually understand the nature of her illness and how she's not been able to fully grasp what is even wrong with her, and has lacked the vocabulary to be able to articulate that. So when she's able to discover what's really wrong with her, it comes as such a relief, but then also places a burden upon her that then she has to deal with her divisions between her own personality and her mental illness and the choices she makes, and that is it's so muddy and difficult, and I think it's so admirable how Meg Mason takes that on and embraces that and confronts that in the relationship, because I did feel really sympathetic with her husband that she's been with for a long time, who she treats really horribly in some ways, and I think part of that is to do with her mental illness, but it is also part to do with her personality. So yeah, it is really difficult and tricky to deal with. I was so drawn into this story, and her first husband, who's also absolute monster, that I thought that was so powerful, that section, how she gets sort of swept into this relationship which she thinks might be an answer, but then realizes it's absolutely not the answer, and so I was so happy when she gets out of that, and so like quite early on, and then he reveals himself to be so horrible, so that she reveals the complexity of the character in that way, but also the complexity of the husband later on, when the husband has a deeper understanding of her than she even thinks she does, and I thought that was so emotional and moving, how, you know, a lot of the people closest to us in our lives, we can sometimes underestimate them and take them for granted, and so how she shows that, I think is so well done. But there are also so many wonderful small observations in this, which are so powerful, and so yeah, I think it is a great novel and probably one of the front runners in the shortlist for the Women's Prize. This sentence by Louise Erdrich, and this, I just I love this as a lover of books, because part of this novel is just all about a love of literature and reading, and what we can do for you, but not just on a superficial level. It like plays really into the plot as well, because there's this book that's been left behind by a bookstore customer that has then gone on to haunt the shop, and the way that the bookseller, the protagonist of this novel, who's has Native American heritage, and how that plays out in her story, I think is well done, and it would have been interesting, I think, to see, because, you know, the big issue I had with this is the way that current events break into the narrative and you know, take up house within the story, because it's an ongoing story that Louise Erdrich said she was writing in real time. And so when she was writing this novel, then the pandemic happened, and there was the murder of George Floyd in her own city, and the protests which occurred after that, which really come to completely fill the narrative. And it would have been interesting in a way to see how the story would have played out if these larger events, like really big worldwide events, hadn't happened, and you can say, well, that's the way that life works, and but at the same time, I think to make a fully satisfying story, I think the ending needs to connect a bit more with the beginning, or like the plot should be more concentrated in a way, but it's difficult, because at the same time, yeah, that is real life, and I do appreciate that she was portraying this, and so I was glad to have this point of view on recent events in this way, because I think it's a really important point of view. But at the same time, yeah, I wonder in like 20 or 30 years time how this novel will be read, and if it'll be read in the same way. But that brings me really neatly onto Ali Smith's book, which I read recently, which also deals with the pandemic and recent events, but is a story that feels like it's much more completely contained and whole, because it involves a character that's kind of over things, and her father is very ill, but then life intrudes upon her by a woman that she hasn't had contact with since her university years, and how she and her family intrude upon her life and literally take up habitation in her house in a time when she is still really worried about the pandemic, and but this woman, her family really aren't worried about it, and so I think it's really encapsulating that tension that a lot of us are feeling during these times when it's still such a big issue going out in public of like whether you wear a mask or not, and the amount of interaction you have with other people and sort of safety measures like that, even though so many of us have been vaccinated now. But yeah, so I think she's really capturing that tension of the present moment, but also making this larger story about how a lot of events in society are cyclical, because there's ghost from the past which intrudes upon this story from like she's from like medieval times, and then how it like circles back to this historical era is so surprising and wonderful, and so yeah, I just completely adored this, and I felt like just as a story, even though it is completely wild and weird, and there's Ali Smith's like trademark playfulness in her language, and but as an entire piece, it comes together, I think, much better than the sentence. So yeah, it's interesting, like thinking about these two books together, and yeah, the different ways that they approach recent events. Now, leaving off the Women's Prize for Fiction list and going to another book that from the International Booker Prize long list that I read, which didn't make the shortlist, but I'm so glad I read this novel as well, the Book of Mother by Violaine Huisman, which is the story of a woman, a mother, who's suffering from mental health and addiction issues, and told from the point of view of one of her daughters. She has two daughters, and the real difficulty these girls had growing up with her mother, who was really struggling with all of these issues, and it really took me by surprise, because at first I thought it was quite a simple story, but then it's actually quite complex and emotionally complex how it approaches this, because it follows how the daughter, she describes what it was like growing up under her mother, but then in the middle of the book she breaks off and wants to understand her mother better, but realizes that she can't ever fully know what her mother's life was like before she was born, as all of us can't understand what our parents' lives were like before we were born, even though we might get small details and stories about them, we can't really completely understand it. So she fictionalizes this background for her mother, and at first I was a bit worried. I was like, oh well, maybe that's a bit too artificial, because it's we realize that she's creating this fiction. It's not the mother's actual story, but it's so moving how she does that, because what she's really doing is showing how she has such a deep sympathy and love for her mother, at the same time as feeling really conflicted about her, because she had such a difficult time growing up under her, and suffered some neglect and abuse in a way, but how there were also moments in as happens quite often in abusive relationships, where the mother was really loving and sweet and towards them, but then things would switch and turn around and turn really ugly and horrible, and it's almost a process of her trying to come to terms with this really difficult upbringing, and grappling with that, and I think it's so beautiful how it shows that, and it's an interesting counterpoint to another novel I read a couple years ago, Burnt Sugar by Avni Doshi, which similarly deals with a daughter who had a really difficult mother, and but how that it shows a much more poisonous outcome of that story, whereas this is incredibly loving and heartfelt, and so I loved Avni Dashi's novel, but it's a much more like darker side, I think, to similar story to what is portrayed in this novel, and I think it's so interesting comparing those two against each other. But yeah, I think it's a really beautiful and powerful novel. Now, I also read a novel as part of a new physical book club that I joined recently, and this was actually the novel that I suggested because it was kind of my turn to host the book club, and so this was one of the suggestions I put forward, and then the group voted to read this, and so this is the whale taught. Oh God, I can't speak today. The Whale Tattoo, The Whale Tattoo by John Ransom. And this is a debut novel about a young man who's from a working class background that's been estranged from his home and his hometown for a couple of years because he fell in love with a man, but then found they couldn't be together, and he experienced a lot of difficulties of prejudice from his father and difficult circumstances, so he just left, and but now he's returned, but the man that he fell in love with has died, and he has interaction, he becomes involved with this late man's wife that he's left behind, who's pregnant, and following their story together, but mainly focused on his point of view as he's kind of drifting around this community and coming to terms with people very close to him, the people closest to him in his life that he's lost, and trying to decide how he wants to carry on forward, and it's really poetic and powerful. Some passages in this describing his journey in his everyday life, but overall the plot of the story is a bit too plodding and a bit overly constructed, that it didn't quite come together or work for me. I couldn't feel too emotionally involved in the characters' lives, even though there are some moments which I think were really beautiful and poignant, and I love the aspects of it where it describes in really frank detail some of the hookups he has, and the physicality of those relationships, and the kind of honesty the author shows to deal with those. I thought was well done, but as a whole, the characters, how they were portrayed and how the plot plays out, I thought was it just didn't quite work for me, and so I found it ultimately a bit disappointing, even though I bought this in Gay's the Word bookstore, and they both the booksellers really hyped it up and sold it to me and said this is one of the greatest novels I've read in quite a while, but yeah, I'm afraid I don't quite agree. So yeah, that was a bit of a shame. And finally, and really briefly, because this was a very brief book, I read the play Hecuba by Euripides, the translation by Frank McGuinness, because for a very specific reason, because tomorrow I'm going to go see the new Punch Drunk production, their new production called The Burnt City, and they're an immersive theater company, so this is meant to be amazing. Anna's gone to see it, and she's reviewed it, and it's where they construct this big set which you will wander through while witnessing scenes from many different actors. I think there's 30 different actors in the production playing out these different scenes, and everyone experiences different things because they're all playing out in different parts of this large space that they've constructed to look like Troy after Troy fell and was destroyed, and so it's meant to take place in the still burning embers of that city and following the events of it. And so Hecuba, in this Greek tragedy, Anna sort of tipped me off that I should know a bit more about this before going to see the production. Hecuba was the Queen of Troy, and was in the events of this play, her daughter is going to be sacrificed for the the spirit and ghost of Achilles, who's demanded a sacrifice, and but also her son, who she sent away for safekeeping, to try to be away from the war, with some gold and wealth, to try to protect from the war. He is betrayed, and so she feels like she's at a point, Hecuba, where she has nothing left to lose, and so she is going to take her revenge. And so it's about the bloody revenge of that. And yeah, there is Greek chorus in this that is commenting upon events, and so it's really interesting to think about it in comparison to Salt Lick, and yeah, the function of a Greek chorus in that way within a story is really interesting, and yeah, and I thought it was so riveting how this play plays out, and I'm going to be so excited to see how that is realized within this larger story built in this immersive theater experience. So I'm really excited about that and looking forward to that, as well as my upcoming holiday, which I'm going to be going on very soon. So yeah, those are all the things that I read this month. Yeah, quite a lot, and a lot to get through, but I'd love to know if you've read any of these books, if you have any thoughts about them, or if you want to discuss any of the things that I talked about in relation to them, or if you're interested in reading them now that I talked about them. Yeah, please let me know about that in the comments below. But also, yeah, if you want to just let me know about what you've read over the past month, some of the things you really enjoyed, or if you really didn't enjoy it, why didn't you enjoy it? Yeah, I'd love to know about all of that as well, because I love to hear what everyone else is reading, and suggestions of things that maybe I should read if I've not read them yet. But thank you for listening to me yammer on about all of these books, and I hope you're doing well and reading good things, and I'll speak to you again soon. Bye-bye.